Before I really get going, number one, I want to thank you for being here. A nice crowd. Secondly, I see students in this audience, and especially some of my own students I want to especially welcome. Thirdly, if you can't hear me very well, kind of let me know, because I have one of these little collar mics, as well as I think, well, I'm not sure whether this one works or not. Fourthly, this is not my day. I have immediately after this talk, I have to run to Wellsville to the dentist. I'm going to donate my body after I die to dental school. I have 8 cavities, so I'm looking forward to an afternoon. Fifthly, there was an article in the New York Times just about a week ago, maybe a little bit more than a week ago. Himmler papers shed light on personal life of a Nazi. Kind of an interesting article. His papers were captured, I guess, confiscated by some Americans, some GIs after the war. They are now, of all places, in Israel, and they have all kinds of interesting things. Letters from his wife to his wife and so forth, copies. On another occasion, Himmler's wife, Marguerite, received a note. "I'm off to Auschwitz. Kisses. Your Heine." Okay, and tells you something about, I guess, the banality of evil, as Hannah Arendt would put it. What I'm going to be doing today, usually I read my comments, and I will be doing a good deal of that. Unfortunately, the light up here is not great. The older I get, the less clearly I can see in dim light. I should do okay, but I'll just hold it. But I also want to make some more general comments, not only about the individual that I'm going to be speaking about today. And by the way, if I may interject just one thing, as I prepare this, as I hear from people, I discover that there are characters all over the place that may in some ways be appropriate for a forum like this. Bill Hall told me just a few minutes ago that one of his, am I right, one of your professors was a member of the Hitler Youth when he was obviously living in Germany. I've heard a number of other stories like that, and so some of you may be able to contribute, particularly when we finish, to comments about this. What I want to begin with is a comment about, if I may, a book that was published, I don't know, I'm going to guess about 2 years, maybe 3 years ago, by University of Oklahoma historian. His name is Stephen Norwood. And the book caught my interest because here I am at a university, and the book is called The Nazis and the Ivory Tower. In other words, how Nazism was viewed in America within the context of universities. Now, we knew a lot about what was going on in Nazi Germany not long after the Nazis came to power. And I'm going to give you a few dates, again, for some of the students who may not be all that familiar with some of the background. Some of you adults may very well know this history. Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany. He took over in Germany at the end of January in 1933. The European phase of that war begins in September of 1939. So there's a period after which he's kind of consolidating power, but it doesn't take very long. And the character of what's happening in Germany, the characteristics of that, are going to be fairly well known to a lot of people very, very soon. And one of the groups that got it right was the Jewish press. Not only in Germany, obviously, but even in the United States. So it's not as if much of what I'm going to be describing here was unknown. A lot of it really was known. If people wanted to know it, the information, so to speak, was out there. And then the Jewish press here in the United States in 1933, again, Hitler's very, very first year in power, they're going to, among other things, quote some of the Nazi leaders like Goebbels and Goering, who together issued in 1933 a proclamation to the effect that the Jewish vampire was responsible for all the troubles from which the Reich was suffering. They proclaimed that it was the duty of all Germans to harass and to persecute the Jews. And they're going to, of course, do this in the coming months. They're going to do it in a number of different ways. They're going to do it with street beatings, Nazi gangs simply beating up Jews on the streets. And not only Jews, I might add, liberals, socialists, communists, those people who were viewed as enemies of the regime. The Jews were driven out of universities in 1933 and 1934. There were boycotts of Jewish business, very, very highly publicized. Not just boycotts. There were there were 500,000 members of the Nazi groups, the SS and the SA, who enforced these boycotts. So, you know, we're not talking again about a small number of people. It was very, very visible, both to the Germans as well as to anyone who was visiting Germany during that period. One journalist would write that this is the worst Jewish persecution. Again, this is 1933. The worst Jewish persecution since the Black Death of 1348, when the Jews were responsible, or held as responsible for the bubonic plague in that year. Stories of brutality were going to be legion, and they found their way into many American newspapers. Again, there's nothing hidden about the kind of story that I'm going to be describing here. The Manchester Guardian in England, pardon me, would note that the violence was neither sporadic nor spontaneous. It was part of a campaign, said the Guardian, deliberately organized by the Nazi Party. There's a great book. I think the best single book. I read a lot on Nazi Germany, maybe not as much as my friend Chris Churchill, but I've read plenty. And the best single book on the subject is this little book by an American writer named Ron Rosenbaum. It's called Explaining Hitler. Easily available on Amazon, easily available in our own bookstore, as a matter of fact. And I recommend it highly. It's a rather impressionistic and in some ways imaginative approach to the whole subject. But he kind of captures the essence of Germany in a way that that you normally would not. He makes the point, for instance, that Hitler very rarely used the word poison. It was an especially strong word for Hitler. But he would use it not almost exclusively, but often as he referred to, to the Jewish menace, as the Jews are poisoning German blood, poisoning Aryan blood, and so forth. It was a rather common kind of thing. He called one of the main newspapers in Germany, in fact, the most important single newspaper in Germany that was an opponent of Hitler, was in Munich. It was called the Munich Post. In 1933, he referred to the Munich Post as the poison kitchen. And that was saying something, okay? And the Munich Post did not have very long to survive as an independent newspaper. By the end of March of 1933, the SA officers, SA was one of the two main kind of popular Nazi groups there, kind of, and they're not soldiers, but they were sort of a paramilitary operation. And they invaded the Munich Post. They destroyed the building. They tossed all of the printing presses out onto the street. They imprisoned the editors. And as an independent newspaper, the Munich Post does not survive 1933. And again, everyone knows what's happening. This is no secret. In Munich, of course, this was very, very well known. And if you want to get a really good sense, maybe the best sense of this deterioration into violence that I'm describing here, I would recommend what to me was a wonderful book. It's called In the Garden of the Beast. I'm sure that some of you have already read this, by Erik Larson. It's a book that was published about 5 or 6 years ago by a very, very good writer, very good American historian. It's a story of the American ambassador. His name is William Dodd, a historian, by the way, that FDR, that Roosevelt appointed in 1933 to serve in Germany. And he brings his family with him, including his daughter, who becomes involved romantically with the head of the Gestapo, and with a Russian agent. He actually eventually becomes a spy for Russia, and with a number of other people, Nazi leaders and so forth. Very, very naive in some ways about what Nazism means initially, although she certainly learns her lesson. But her father was really very, very perceptive. And Larson describes, for instance, at one point a rally that he had been invited to in Nuremberg, which is the headquarters of the Nazi Party. And he's at the rally, he's outside on the street. He sees a large crowd gathering. He looks over to see what's going on, and it appears that two stormtroopers are kind of carrying along a clown. Well, it wasn't a clown. It was a young girl. Her name was Anna Rath. And she was, kind of dressed as sort of a clown. And then her head was shaved, her entire, her clothes, her head, all covered in white powder, and she's wearing a sign. And the sign says, "I offered myself to a Jew." And what's remarkable about that is not so much that the Nazis would do that sort of thing. They were not only into violence and even killing their opponents, but into humiliating their opponents before they killed those opponents. And her fate was, I think, in some ways rather typical. But again, what was remarkable about it was what Dodd describes as the reaction of the crowds. Large numbers of people applauding, large numbers of people laughing, large numbers of people mocking her and so forth. This was a popular reaction. And Nazism was, becoming more, not less popular during this period. Now, the reason I'm mentioning all this is that we knew this, okay? A lot of this stuff is being broadcast to the United States. We didn't have TV, of course, in those days, but you get some of it through radios. But the newspapers are carrying this story and carrying plenty of this story. What caught my attention in respect to all of this is the way in which the universities reacted. And the universities reacted, I would argue, not very well at all. And we're going to find during these years that while university presidents are going to occasionally protest what's going on, through petitions that were published in newspapers like the Washington Post and the New York Times and so forth, the presidents of the larger universities, what today we would call the elite universities, were very, very rarely participating in these kinds of protests, or even tolerating these kinds of protests on their own campuses. We're going to find, for instance, that the president of, well, before I leave the small universities, maybe what I ought to note is that in 1936 or in 1937, I can't remember the year, but in 1936 or 37, the president of Alfred, J. Nelson Norwood, participates in this. He signs a letter that appears in the New York Times. And it's a very, very strong statement of opposition and also a recognition that the Americans may have to play an international role along with the British and the French and others in respect to this menace that's developing in Germany. But you don't find this kind of a reaction on the larger universities. The president of Harvard, for instance, delivered. There's a James Conant, who is in many ways a remarkably, talented and bright guy. But he's going to discourage protests on his own campus. In 1935 or 1936, again, I don't remember the year, a German official who had been a Harvard graduate, as a matter of fact, had been captain of the baseball team back in 1909, visits Harvard. There are students, anti-fascist students, who put posters up around the campus to protest his visit, and the president orders all these signs to be torn down. He doesn't want to, he doesn't want to in any way, alienate the officials, alienate the German government, because among other things, Harvard has programs, cooperative programs, back in that period with the Germans. And it's not just Conant. Nicholas Murray Butler, who was a very, very well-known guy. He had won the Nobel Peace Prize, of all things, in 1931. But he was also the president of Columbia University, who, I might add, began the process back during that earlier period in the 20th century, of instituting quotas against Jewish students. He was quite anti-Semitic. He wanted to reduce the number of Jews at Columbia because it was in New York City, a large Jewish population, and he manages to do so. And so, for instance, on the application form, you'll now have to place not only your religion, but your mother's maiden name, where both of your parents were born, and so forth and so on. You have to go for a personal interview as a way to weed out Jewish applicants who otherwise were, academically at least, very qualified for Columbia. At another point, in 1935, the University of Heidelberg celebrates its 500th anniversary. Columbia is going to send a delegation to celebrate among others, that anniversary. But Heidelberg had also, the previous year, actually the celebration was in 36, but in 35, Heidelberg had announced that it was going to devote its science studies to the furtherance of Nazi racial policies, to the racial purity of the German race. And they would perform, sterilization in their hospital and so forth and so on. In other words, it was becoming an increasingly untenable situation. The Nazis at that very same time were burning books. Among the books that they were burning were the books of Franz Boas, who was an American anthropologist, maybe the leading anthropologist during that period, who was a critic of this kind of racial policy, who taught at Columbia University, and in spite of that, Butler sent that delegation over. And when a student protested that kind of thing in 1936, protested sending the delegation. Butler simply dismissed the kid from the university, simply expelled him. And back in that period, there really wasn't any kind of there wasn't any check on that sort of abuse of power. So, again, my point. Hey, a lot of this stuff is very, very public. There were demonstrations, some large demonstrations in Madison Square Garden in New York. There was a demonstration in 1933 in Madison Square Garden. Every single seat was sold out. A demonstration protesting Nazi policy. And there were about 500,000 people in other areas, in other cities in the United States, who joined this kind of a thing. Again, my point, we knew a lot about what was going on. Now, why am I saying all this? Why am I kind of beating up on the universities? It's not so much to simply say, well, the small universities like Alfred were doing a great job, but the big universities were kind of complicit in what was happening in Germany. It wasn't so much that they were complicit. It was rather that they simply chose not to deal with it. Okay, they chose to dampen in any way protest on their own campuses. By 1935 and 1936, the situation is getting more serious. And it was in 1937 that a young man by the name of Edward Sittler, he had been born in Ohio. He was born in Delaware, Ohio. And if I may just add something, a little coincidence that I discovered yesterday. We talk about Tokyo Rose. I may say something about her later. Talk about Axis Sally, who was actually, there was more than one. There were about 3 or 4 women who broadcast for the Nazis to American troops. They were, they had been American citizens who, kind of turned. They went over to the, to the Hitler side. The most important of those Axis Sallies was a woman by the name of Mildred Gillars. And she went to Ohio Wesleyan College, and she begins Ohio Wesleyan in 1916. In 1917, Edward Sittler, actually in October of 1916, Edward Sittler is born. Edward Sittler is going to be the centerpiece of most of the rest of what I'm going to talk about right here. And I want to, kind of focus on this. But again, as I relate this to my earlier comments, it's simply this, that when Sittler went over, he was 21 years old. His age matters. He wasn't a young kid. He wasn't a 15-year-old teenager. He was 21 years old. He was the age of a college graduate. And by the time that he had gone over, he had already spent 2 years at Bard College. He had already spent 2 years at Ohio State. And then he chose, before he got his degree, to head over to Germany, where he presumably would study. And I'm going to be reading a good deal of what I have to say to you from now on. So I kind of apologize. Almost 51 years ago, in April of 1963, the Federal Second Circuit Court, okay, Supreme Court is at the very top of our judicial hierarchy. Right below it are the circuit appeals courts, and below that the district courts. Okay, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals in New York rejected the application of Sittler. Okay, rejected, in other words, when Sittler had appealed a lower court, a district court decision, which had denied him the right to citizenship. Except perhaps for his family, few people remember the case. Now again, I want to remind you, whatever I'm going to say about Sittler, it comes in the context of all of this additional information that we knew about Germany by 1937. Sittler, as I said, was not a kid. He was a, he was a young man. He knew plenty about what was going on in Germany by 1937. Considering that he was born in an all-American town, okay, one might wonder why Sittler would be requesting citizenship in the first place. And the answer to that question will shed light not only on an obscure corner of World War II history, but also on issues of academic freedom and the nature of the university during the 1950s and into the 1960s and so forth. Almost 5 years before the court ruled, in 1958, Dr. Charles Buchanan, who was a longtime professor of German at Alfred University, had suffered a heart attack. The university, this is in the early part of, it was in September of 1958, or just at the beginning of the academic year. The university looked for a temporary replacement. Sittler got the job, almost surely with the help of his brother Joseph, who at that time was a very, very well-known and very distinguished professor of theology at the University of Chicago. Sittler served unremarkably through the remainder of 1958. There were no scandals. There were no charges of anti-Semitism. Be patient. 3 of his kids attended Alfred. One of them graduated from AU. But Sittler had some trouble getting another job afterwards. Eventually, he was hired by the dean of Long Island University's C.W. Post College to teach German and also to teach English Lit. Few people noticed him. Few people noticed that hire. Until, that is, an enterprising reporter from a newspaper called the Long Island Daily Press, and it was soon followed up by another Long Island newspaper called the Star, I forget, Star Telegram, something like that. I forget the name of it. Until they were alerted to what was going on. And what was going on were certain irregularities. Okay, the press was alerted to certain irregularities in his past, and yeah, they were irregularities indeed. Sittler had been a Nazi during World War II. The C.W. Post Pioneer, the campus newspaper, headlines: Sittler resigns his post at C.W. Post. Even the New York Times broadcast news of his resignation. It became a minor league national story. Yeah, Sittler had been a Nazi. Born in October of 1916, he had attended Bard, Ohio State, married an Ohio co-ed, soon divorced, and then, not yet having graduated, as I said, set out for Germany at the age of 21, where he studied history, and he also studied literature. He studied at the universities at Tübingen and also in Berlin. He was hardly a naive teenager. He would later tell a court that his desire to live in Germany stemmed from his love of his German family and Germany's historic culture. He said little about Nazism. In November of 1938, the outrage called Kristallnacht, and just so that you have some sense as to what I'm talking about here, Kristallnacht was a Nazi assault against virtually the entire Jewish community throughout Germany. Approximately 1,000 synagogues were torched, as you see right here. I believe that this is in Berlin, but I'm not sure. About 1,000 were torched. Thousands and thousands of Jewish businesses were destroyed. The Jewish owners of these businesses, on their hands and knees, were forced to clean up all of the wreckage and so forth. You heard what I said about humiliation before. And so this is carried in newspapers not all over Germany. I mean, you couldn't miss it if you were in Germany. All over newspapers around the world. Sittler had to have seen this. By 1938, he was living in Berlin. And less than a year later, on September 1st of 1939, Hitler ordered his army to attack Poland. 3 days later, actually 4 days later, 4 days after the beginning of World War II, Hitler applies to become a German citizen. Nor did he just seek to become a German citizen. In the spring of 1940, about the time that Berlin granted his citizenship request, he also renounced his American citizenship. He was then drafted into the Wehrmacht. The Wehrmacht is the German army. And he was assigned to work as a translator, and then eventually as a propagandist in the German radio service, subsequently called the German Broadcasting System. He reported that he twice volunteered for service on the Eastern Front after Hitler declared war on the Soviet Union in the summer of in June of 1941. Maybe he did. We have no proof that he did. We have no proof, of course, that he did not. He claimed that the German army rejected his offer. After Pearl Harbor, and again, remember the chronology here, if I may. Germany declared war. Germany begins the war in 1939. Pearl Harbor occurs in December of 1941, and 3 days after the Japanese hit the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, 3 days later, Germany declares war on the U.S., and then 1 day later, the Americans declare war on Germany. Germany initiated that process. After Pearl Harbor and continuing until the last days of the war, he helped to broadcast shortwave programs, shortwave radio programs, to American soldiers and to the United States mainland. You could pick this up if you had shortwave. Though he would later claim that these broadcasts were not anti-American, he called, among other things, for the impeachment of FDR as a traitor. He ridiculed America's allies, and he claimed that Jewish industrialists instigated the war. As a matter of fact, he would also claim that the reason that the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor was to serve the interests of the Jewish masters in the United States, and also, he said, the interests of the British Empire. Sittler had company By 1943, he had been joined by 4 other Americans, a man by the name of Monte, another Chandler, another Best, and another by the name of Bergman. I'll bring these names up again. I'm going to kind of go over this a little bit more quickly than I would like to. They too broadcast or translated for the Third Reich. So did Mildred Gillars, that's the Axis Sally, who I mentioned to you a few minutes ago. For some Americans, Nazism was contagious. Treason was contagious. After the war, Sittler's companions would be tried. They would be convicted as traitors, every one of the ones I just mentioned. But not Sittler. Remember, he had renounced his American citizenship. And you can only accuse someone and then convict them of treason if they're a citizen of the company. Having renounced American citizenship, in some ways he was, he was free of that charge. So while these other people are going to wind up in jail, Mr. Sittler is not. He's going to wind up at Alfred University, but we'll come back to that. In 1943, in the middle of the war, he joins the Nazi Party. He would testify later that he saw the Nazis not just as saviors of Germany, but saviors of Western civilization. He swallowed whole Hitler's propaganda, which portrayed Germany as a bulwark against the tide of Bolshevism. After the war, Sittler would claim that Hitler's war against the USSR served not just Germany's interest, but the welfare of the United States. Okay? Not just Germany's interest, but the welfare of the United States. His explanation was consistent with comments he had already made publicly at CW Post, and also comments he had made in his first trial in district court in 1960 before U.S. District Court Judge Lloyd Francis McMahon. And I'm going to come back to McMahon because he's an outstanding jurist and plays a very, very important role in this whole subject. He told McMahon that he renounced his American citizenship in order to do what is absolutely essential for the preservation of Germany, because it is essential to the preservation of the United States. Now, a historian might note that he renounced his American citizenship after Hitler had signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, and a year before Germany had actually attacked the Soviet Union, went to war against the Soviet Union, which is a way of saying this, that the timing that I've just outlined seriously, seriously weakens his claim that he renounced his citizenship in order to join the battle against, quote, Bolshevism. Sittler, like Hitler, had gambled. Both lost. Germany surrendered in May of 1945. American military officials incarcerated Sittler for a year after the war. But now things get even more interesting. For by 1946, the Army permitted him to return to the U.S. as a, quote, temporary alien, despite the renunciation of citizenship. So, of course, we want to know why. Why did they let him back in? Unfortunately, the record here really isn't very clear, and it may be because it's deliberately not clear, because people didn't want to commit some of this to writing. He claims that he was offered the right to join the CIA. We have no evidence for this, and I doubt whether we ever will have evidence for this. I doubt whether any of these, documents even exist. Most likely, okay, and I'm speculating, most likely he was readmitted to the U.S. on condition that he would provide information, testimony, if you will, about German broadcast activities during the war. His temporary alien status would be extended to a year-by-year basis until the trials of the others ended. These other trials are going to end in 1950, okay, of these other traitors. During this period, he was permitted to pursue a doctorate in comparative literature, which he does at Northwestern University, and he winds up teaching at Northwestern for more or less 2 years just to, support his growing family. Now, what we know for certain is that he cooperated with the Internal Security Division of the Department of Justice as it prepared to try Nazi propagandists like Best and Chandler and try them for treason. Victor Vorheide, a special assistant to the Attorney General during those years, had extensive conversations with Sittler, was in a sense the guy who interrogated Sittler. Vorheide came to respect Sittler, and eventually, some years later, about 12 years later, would testify on Sittler's behalf when Sittler was going to apply for, to reapply, if you will, for citizenship. During the treason trials of Best and Chandler, between 1946 to 1948, Sittler winds up testifying both for the defense and for the prosecution. I know of no other instance in which that kind of thing happens. He's going to claim he did it because he wanted to be impartial. He wanted to be fair. You can draw your own conclusions. Regardless of the circumstances of his return, the government permitted him to remain in the U.S. beyond 1950. He had remarried during his years in Germany, and he was prolific as hell. He fathered 8 children with his second wife. She was German, born German. She was also a British citizen. In early 1949, he was hired by Michigan Tech. At that time, it was called Michigan College of Mining and Technology. He taught there. He taught literature. The trustees voided his contract before even classes started in September. The official story, remember, he had a contract now, okay, they had a legal obligation to teach. The official story was that they discovered that his temporary visa would expire before the end of the academic year. More likely, the real reason they fired him, or did not hire him, or whatever, didn't let him teach, resulted from the angry protests of a Michigan congressman by the name of John Bennett, who in turn was influenced by a very demagogic, how shall I put it, a commentator on radio. Some of you will remember his name. His name is Walter Winchell. He got onto Sittler's case back in that period, and he made it virtually impossible for Michigan to continue to employ the man. In any case, for the next 4 years, he kind of wandered around. He was a lumberjack. He worked as a laborer. He did a little bit of teaching. He was an office manager and so forth. He was granted, finally, in 1954, after he came back from a short stay in Cuba, he was granted the status of permanent resident. He almost surely got the permanent status by having his Justice Department friend, Victor Verheyde, who I mentioned before, to testify in his behalf. And I want to remind you, this is the height of the McCarthy period, when anti-communism would in some ways have played very much into the kind of appeal that Sittler was suggesting he was involved with, you know, his anti-Soviet activities. In any case, he now returned to at least to his quest for academic employment. During the 50s, he taught at a number of small colleges. Shortlift in Alton, Illinois, Kiel, which is a Lutheran college in Greenville, Pennsylvania. He taught at Alfred for just 1 year, and finally he winds up at C.W. Post. His fate at Michigan Tech could not have, made things better for him. To make matters worse, he was then fired at Shortlift College. And this is kind of interesting. He was fired because he defended a number of other faculty who themselves were being fired for reasons that had nothing to do with Nazism. And he was already by this time involved with what's called the AAUP, the American Association of University Professors, that argued the case for academic freedom and so forth for faculty. In any case, the AAUP would call the decision of Dean Hoxie, I hope I have this right, at C.W. Post, which hires him after he leaves Alfred, okay, would call the decision by C.W. Post to hire him courageous, okay, humane and courageous. A comment that perhaps was influenced by the fact that Sittler was already, an AAUP member. In fact, as I say, he was not merely a member, but I think he was actually the president of the AAUP chapter at Shortlift College somewhat earlier. Now, Sittler, when he was hired at C.W. Post after leaving Alfred, and again, I want to remind you, he's hired at Alfred for what reason? Because Professor Buchanan suffered a heart attack. My hunch is that the Alfred University president was in desperate need of someone, and quickly Sittler's application was out there, and so he hired him. Were questions asked? I'll come back to that in a few minutes. Had he informed officers at C.W. Post about his Nazi background? The answer is categorically yes. Had he informed officers at the other colleges? Probably he did. I have no proof that Alfred's president, who at that time was a man by the name of M. Ellis Drake, I have no proof that Drake knew about his Nazi background. But I cannot believe that Drake was ignorant of it. Sittler must have known that lying about his past, by commission or by omission, might, if discovered, lead to his being fired or even deported. Not only by Alfred, but by any of these other colleges as well. Certainly Dean Hoxie at C.W. Post understood the risks of an ugly row should Sittler's history become public. So Hoxie and Sittler agreed when he was hired that Sittler's employment must not threaten to embarrass the college or should events prove, of course, that that Sittler had lied about his circumstances. And under those conditions, in other words, that Sittler would resign if that happened. He was hired, and he would teach at CW Post from September of 1959 until December of that year. And when the Long Island Daily Press and the Long Island Star Journal went public, all hell broke loose. The story did go national. On Long Island, veterans organizations, Jewish organizations, others registered protest. Angry letters poured into editorial offices, including the CW Post campus newspaper. Yet Sittler had his defenders. 20 people, among them former students, including at least one from Alfred University, will wind up testifying on his behalf when he applied for citizenship, back in that very, very same year of 1959 and then 60. Years later, the AAP would censure CW Post for terminating him in spite of his promise to Hoxie to resign if the story went public. And I'll have a comment to say about this in a few minutes as well. And this brings me to what I consider to be the really central issue of his application for citizenship. A key criterion for citizenship is that the applicant, for 5 years preceding his application, must reside in the U.S. in a fashion to prove, quote, his good moral character. He must be, quote, be attached to the principles of the Constitution. And he must be, again, I quote from the law, be well disposed to the good order and happiness of the United States. Did Sittler qualify? Because after he was fired from CW Post, he applies for citizenship. As a matter of fact, he was in the process of doing that even before he was fired. At least on a superficial level, the answer would appear to be yes. My college roommate, who was a Jew from Yonkers, New York, right here at Alfred, took German 102 from Sittler. He recalls no evidence, and I talked to him just 3 years ago. He recalls absolutely no evidence of anti-Semitism, and he would have been sensitive enough to it. Other Alfred alumni agree. I only had one person who in any way related to his Nazi past, and I don't believe that she knew what she was talking about. I don't think that any of us knew at that time that he had a Nazi past. 23 CW Post students, including some with Jewish names, signed a petition supporting him. Okay? Indeed, it was this kind of evidence that led one of the 3 federal court judges on the Circuit Court of Appeals to ultimately rule in his favor. But William Kenville, who was the naturalization officer, the naturalization examiner, as who had conducted the hearing over citizenship in 1960, he disagreed. Despite Sittler's praise for our constitutional principle and his claim that he had been misled when he renounced his American citizenship, Kenville was aware, who was, I'm sure, very aware that there was a public controversy over all this. Kenville rejected his application. Did public pressure have anything to do with that? The answer is, we'll never know. My guess, more likely, assuming good faith on the part of Kenville, he just did not believe Sittler's affirmation of loyalty. And so the ex-Nazi went to federal court again. First at the district level, where the matter was argued before the highly regarded Judge Lloyd Francis McMahon in New York, and then he went eventually to the Circuit Court of Appeals, where a 3-judge panel would reject his application for citizenship. The district court heard him condemn anti-Semitism and praise the Constitution. More important, it read the testimony of witnesses at the naturalization hearing who claimed that Sittler had acted in observance of those principles. And especially acted in observance of those principles during the previous 5 years. That's a really critical period here. But Judge McMahon, in a blistering opinion, noted that Sittler's testimony was riddled with, and you can read it right here, distortions, half-truths, incomplete answers, misleading responses, evasion, concealment, hedging, suppression, equivocation, and endless quibbling, that the court can give it no credence, no believability, in others, whatever. Surely, he concluded, the government is entitled to the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Anything less cannot be tolerated. After which, the judge damned Sittler for something equally serious, namely his utter lack of understanding of the Constitution he professed to uphold. Wrote Judge McMahon, The inference that Sittler has a preference for a hostile form of government is deepened by his testimony that he always remained attached to the principles of the Constitution despite his allegiance to Germany. Now look, what McMahon was saying, I think in no uncertain terms, is this. You can be loyal to the principles of the United States Constitution. You can be loyal to the principles of Nazi Germany, but you can't be loyal to both at the same time. And Sittler was claiming exactly that he was loyal to both at the same time. Okay? Why did he do that? Maybe he misunderstood the principles. Maybe he misunderstood the Constitution. Maybe he was simply lying in order to, among other things, become a citizen again, to get those jobs for which he had applied at these different colleges, including Alfred. Sittler refused to give up. His naturalization lawyers, one of whom was a man by the name of William Stringfellow, and some of you who are old enough to remember that name, Stringfellow was a very, very prominent theologian, a very good lawyer, and very much involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement, defending, I might add, Vietnam War protesters back in the early 1960s at this very same time. Okay, he defended Sittler at the next level. Although each circuit court annually gets hundreds of applications for cases to be heard, in fact, very few are actually accepted, and Sittler's case was one of them. So the circuit court in New York heard Sittler's appeal. Okay, they heard the appeal. The appeal was heard by a circuit court that included 3 people. One was Judge Hayes, one was Judge Kaufman. Again, maybe these names are a little bit familiar to you. And one was a judge by the name of Charles Clark, again, who was very, very highly regarded. In the final analysis, the circuit court is going to rule 2-1 against Sittler. Clark voted in favor. The other 2 are going to reject the appeal. Now, his appeal was based on the premise that the district court failed to adequately credit his adherence to American constitutional principles. The appellate court reviewed the issue, but focused on his rationale for joining the Nazi Party and what the court viewed as his tepid repudiation of his earlier beliefs. Sittler had previously told the district court that he considered Hitler to be a scourge. He claimed that Nazi officials had, quote, committed crimes, the enormity of which staggers the imagination. He said as much publicly when the C.W. Post controversy was going on. Okay? So some of that was not new, and one might expect if you're applying for citizenship, you might indeed say that sort of thing. But much of his testimony was simply unbelievable. Asked about the relationship of Nazi philosophy to Nazi rule, he undermined his own veracity by testifying that Hitler's persecution of the Jews was, quote, not as inclusive as it was generally reported. He knew Jewish members of the German army. He denied that he had ever heard or read that the German race was superior to others, or that he ever heard the doctrine of the superiority of German blood. And he denied, I might add, that Nazi policy was specifically geared to the concept of Lebensraum, which meant, in other words, expansion into areas of Eastern Europe. At C.W. Post, he had already said some of this during the war, that he thought that rumors about the killing of Jews was simply communist propaganda. Now look, if you read the stuff from today's perspective, and as I go back and I read the transcripts here, what he's saying is simply not believable. And that's why Judge McMahon ruled as he did, and that's why the majority, of course, on the circuit court is going to do the same. Judge Clark commended him for his candor, but the other judges viewed Sittler as anything but candid. Nevertheless, the circuit court's decision rested not on his lack of candor. As Judge Hayes explained, the district court did not hold, and we do not suggest that Sittler's citizenship should be denied because of bad moral character. And I might add, this also gets a little complicated because Sittler's moral character had been an issue at the district court level. Okay, as Judge McMahon wrote in his own stinging opinion, Sittler's lack of candor is enough of a sufficient flaw, so that in his moral character to warrant a denial of his petition for citizenship. To the appeals court, the key issue boiled down to one simple question. Had Sittler established that he was attached to the principles of the Constitution? And was he well disposed toward its greater good and happiness? The appeals court majority held very, very clearly that that test had not been met, and therefore his petition once again was denied. Now, Sittler died in 1987. He would never again hold a teaching position. The AA eventually moved on, and I'm a little bit longer than I wanted to speak here, so let me just kind of sum some of this up. The AAUP would then investigate what happened at CW Post and would finally rule that CW Post had violated standards regarding academic employment. And when I say that regarded, that violated standards, they didn't say that CW Post had really violated his academic freedom. As a matter of fact, they never really addressed that issue at all. What they claimed was that CW Post had not given him a hearing, had not given him an adequate hearing at the point when they were about to fire him. And what the AAUP argues is that that is a violation of due process. And I think that most of us in this room, if you're faculty members, would probably agree with that. He wasn't given that hearing. Now, of course, what CW Post claimed was, wait a minute, the guy had already agreed in advance that he would resign if this became a public issue. And that's true, okay? He had agreed to that. But the AAUP was basically saying it doesn't matter. Okay, he is still entitled to that hearing, and without that hearing, we cannot judge that he was fired for valid reasons. I got more that I would like to say. I want to say something about his brother. I want to say a little bit about Access Sally, but it is 1 o'clock. I really apologize for going on as long as I did. Thank you for your attention. And I am happy to accept questions. I don't